December 16th, 1941. The jungle air hung thick over Luzon as Captain Tanaka Hiroshi crouched beside the wreckage of an American supply convoy. 9 days after Pearl Harbor, the world still smelled of cordite and victory. His men had routed the retreating Americans from their positions near Fort Stotsenburg, capturing weapons, ammunition, and documents in the chaos. But it was the machine gun that caught his attention. Mounted on a destroyed half-track, still warm from recent fire, sat a massive weapon unlike anything in the Imperial Army's arsenal. Its barrel was as thick as a man's wrist, its receiver machined with a precision that seemed almost excessive. The Americans had abandoned it intact, fleeing so quickly they hadn't disabled the weapon. Tanaka ran his fingers along the cooling metal. "Heavy," he muttered. "Too heavy for infantry." His sergeant laughed. "Americans always over-engineer everything. This probably jams after 50 rounds. They would soon discover how wrong that assumption was. Because what they had found wasn't just a machine gun. It was the Browning M2, a weapon so reliable, so devastatingly effective, that it would still be in service 8 decades later. And, hidden in the technical manual they pulled from the ammunition box, lay a number that would haunt Japanese military planners for the rest of the war. Production capacity: 60,000 units per year. That morning, victory tasted simple. By nightfall, doubt would begin to creep in, because the gun they mocked as overbuilt would prove indestructible, and the number in that manual would reveal an industrial truth Japan had no way to match. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The weapon itself demanded respect even before they understood its significance. Tanaka ordered 2 men to dismount it from the destroyed vehicle, and they struggled under its weight. 84 pounds without ammunition, 128 pounds with the tripod fully assembled. It was a brute, designed not for portability but for punishment. Japanese heavy machine guns, the Type 92 and Type 93, were formidable in their own right, but they weighed significantly less and required careful maintenance to function reliably. This American weapon felt different. Overbuilt, yes, but in a way that suggested permanence rather than waste. Sergeant Yamada knelt beside the receiver and examined the barrel assembly. "Sir, this system allows the barrel to be changed in seconds," he demonstrated, releasing the latch and sliding the heavy barrel free with practiced ease. The Japanese guns required tools and time. This one could be serviced in the middle of battle. Tanaka picked up the technical manual, its cover still crisp despite the humidity. TM9-225. Browning machine gun, caliber .50 M2. Inside were exploded, diagrams, maintenance schedules, and operational specifications written in clear, methodical English. He flipped through the pages, pausing at a section titled Production and Supply. His eyes narrowed as he read the figures. Estimated annual production, 60,000 units. Monthly output, 5,000 units. Primary manufacturers: Colt's Patent Firearms, Frigidaire, AC Spark Plug Division. He read the line again. Frigidaire, AC Spark Plug. These weren't weapons manufacturers. They were companies that made refrigerators and automobile parts, and they were building heavy machine guns by the thousands. Yamada leaned over his shoulder. "Is that accurate, sir?" Tanaka closed the manual slowly. "If it is, then we are not fighting an army. We are fighting an economy." The next morning, December 17th, Tanaka's unit set up a makeshift testing range in a cleared section of jungle near their encampment. The Browning M2 sat on its tripod, aimed downrange at a row of abandoned Filipino vehicles the Americans had left behind. The captured ammunition belts, each holding 100 rounds of .50 caliber cartridges, lay coiled beside the weapon like sleeping serpents. "Let us see if American engineering matches American boasting," Tanaka said. He chambered the first round and pressed the butterfly trigger. The sound was not the sharp crack of a rifle or even the chattering burst of a light machine gun. It was a deep, rhythmic thunder that echoed across the valley like the heartbeat of something vast and terrible. The first burst of 10 rounds punched through the door of a truck 200 yards away, each impact tearing metal like paper. Tanaka adjusted his aim and fired again. This time, 50 rounds in a sustained burst. The barrel glowed faintly but did not warp. The action cycled without hesitation. Not a single jam, not a single misfire. He stopped and waited for the weapon to cool. Then he fired another 100 rounds, then another. By the time the test concluded, they had fired over 600 rounds through the Browning without cleaning it, without adjusting it, without a single malfunction. Yamada stood silent, his face pale. "Sir, our Type 92 would have overheated after 200 rounds." Tanaka nodded slowly. He had seen Japanese machine guns seize up in combat, their barrels warped from sustained fire, their intricate mechanisms clogged with dirt and carbon. This American weapon had endured conditions that would have destroyed any gun in the Imperial arsenal, and it was still ready to fire. One of the younger soldiers approached nervously. "Captain, if they can build these by the thousands." Tanaka cut him off with a raised hand. He didn't want to think about that yet, not while the taste of victory was still fresh. But the question lingered like smoke. If this weapon was standard issue, if every American unit carried them, if 60,000 of these were being produced every year, then what did that mean for Japan's chances in a long war? The intelligence report reached Tokyo on December 23, 1941. Captain Tanaka's findings, along with the captured technical manual and photographs of the Browning M2, were forwarded through military channels to the Army Technical Bureau and the Ministry of Munitions. The response was immediate but divided. Some officers dismissed the production figures as propaganda. 60,000 heavy machine guns per year? Impossible. That would require more steel, more machining capacity, and more industrial coordination than any nation possessed. It had to be an exaggeration, a psychological trick meant to demoralize anyone who captured the manual. But others, particularly those who had studied American industry before the war, knew better. Colonel Nakamura Kenji, a liaison officer who had toured American factories in 1938, read the report with a sinking feeling. He had walked through the Ford River Rouge complex in Michigan, a single facility that employed 100,000 workers and produced a complete automobile every 49 seconds. He had seen the scale of American manufacturing firsthand. If they could build cars that fast, why not machine guns? The Browning M2 had been in production since 1933. By 1941, the design was mature, the tooling perfected, the supply chains established. Colts, the primary manufacturer, had spent years refining the process. And now, with war declared, companies like Frigidaire and AC Sparkplug were being contracted to expand production using the same mass manufacturing techniques that built consumer goods. It wasn't propaganda. It was simple industrial arithmetic. Nakamura drafted a memo to his superiors. The figures in the captured manual should be considered credible. American industrial capacity is not constrained by traditional limitations. They do not build weapons as we do, one at a time with artisan precision. They build them as they build automobiles, in vast quantities, with interchangeable parts, using assembly line methods that prioritize volume over craftsmanship. If the United States maintains this production rate, they will field more heavy machine guns in 1 year than Japan possesses in its entire military inventory. The memo was filed, read, and quietly ignored. Because in late 1941, Japan was winning, the Philippines were falling, Singapore would soon follow. The empire was expanding faster than anyone had predicted. Why worry about American production capacity when Japanese forces were achieving victory after victory? But in the field, the men who had seen the Browning M2 in action knew better. They had felt its weight, heard its thunder, watched it chew through steel without faltering. And they understood, with a clarity that Tokyo refused to accept, that this weapon was not an anomaly. It was a promise, a glimpse of what was coming. By early 1942, more captured, Browning M2s began appearing across the Pacific theater. Japanese forces found them mounted on destroyed American tanks, abandoned at airfields, and aboard sunken patrol boats. Each discovery reinforced the same troubling conclusion. This weapon was everywhere. Unlike specialized equipment issued sparingly to elite units, the Browning M2 was standard. Infantry companies had them for anti-aircraft defense. Vehicle crews mounted them on jeeps, trucks, and half-tracks. Naval vessels carried them in multiple positions. The Americans had distributed these guns with the casual abundance of a nation that could afford to equip every unit with heavy firepower. Japanese ordnance officers attempted to reverse engineer the weapon, disassembling captured examples to study their construction. What they found was both impressive and disheartening. The M2's design was deceptively simple. It operated on a short recoil principle, using the force of each shot to cycle the action and chamber the next round. There were no fragile springs, no overly complex mechanisms. Every part was machined to tolerances that ensured interchangeability. A barrel from one gun could fit another. A bolt assembly could be swapped in seconds. This was engineering for mass production. Japan's heavy machine guns, by contrast, were products of careful hand-fitting. Each weapon was slightly unique, its parts adjusted by skilled armorers to ensure proper function. They worked beautifully when maintained by experts. But they could not be built quickly, and they could not be repaired in the field without specialized knowledge. The captured technical manual became a teaching tool at the Army Technical Bureau. Officers studied its exploded diagrams and maintenance procedures, marveling at the clarity of American technical writing. Every step was illustrated, every tolerance specified. A conscript with minimal training could maintain this weapon using the manual alone. Nakamura saw the deeper implication. They have designed a system that does not rely on expertise. Any factory, any workforce, can build these. Any soldier, no matter how inexperienced, can operate them. They have removed the human variable. He paused, choosing his words carefully. They have industrialized warfare itself. The production numbers haunted those who understood them. 60,000 Browning M2s per year meant 164 weapons completed every single day, nearly 7 per hour. If American factories operated in 3 shifts, that meant a new heavy machine gun rolled off the assembly line every 25 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Japan, by comparison, produced approximately 2,000 heavy machine guns per year across all models. For every weapon Japan built, America built 30. The math was suffocating. But it wasn't just the Browning. Intelligence reports began arriving from across the Pacific, each one adding another layer to the nightmare. American infantry, rifles, 2 million per year. American artillery pieces, tens of thousands annually. American tanks, 50,000 by 1943. American aircraft, 96,000 in 1944 alone. Every category revealed the same pattern. American production wasn't just larger. It was exponentially larger, operating on a scale that defied comparison. Japanese factories worked with the dedication and skill expected of a proud industrial nation. But they were building weapons the old way, with time-intensive methods that prioritized quality and precision. America had abandoned that approach entirely. They built weapons like they built tractors, fast, functional, and in quantities that allowed for waste. If a rifle jammed, throw it away and grab another. If a tank broke down, leave it and request a replacement. The logistics officers in Tokyo ran the calculations again and again, hoping to find an error. There was none. Japan's entire industrial output, even running at maximum wartime capacity, could not match American production in any single category. The empire had entered a war of attrition against an opponent that could absorb losses indefinitely. And the weapon that had revealed this truth was a machine gun so overbuilt that it would outlast the war, outlast the century, and remain in service longer than any other firearm in history. The Browning M2 wasn't just a gun, it was a symbol, proof that America's strength lay not in superior tactics or braver soldiers, but in the cold, relentless power of factories that never slept. By mid-1942, the initial euphoria of Japan's early victories had begun to fade among those who studied the numbers. The capture of Singapore, the fall of the Philippines, and the conquest of the Dutch East Indies had secured resources and territory. But they had also exposed a growing problem: supply. Every captured American position revealed the same abundance: mountains of ammunition, spare parts, medical, supplies, and rations. The Browning M2s, they found, were often accompanied by thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, more than a Japanese unit would receive in months of allocation. Officers reported back with disbelief. The Americans supplied their forces as if logistics were infinite. Colonel Nakamura compiled a report comparing Japanese and American supply doctrine. His findings were disturbing. A standard Japanese infantry regiment received approximately 50 heavy machine guns for its entire strength. An equivalent American regiment had over 100 Browning M2s, not counting vehicle-mounted guns or anti-aircraft positions. Japanese units were expected to conserve ammunition, firing only when necessary. American units were encouraged to use suppressive fire freely, knowing resupply was constant. The philosophy was completely different. Japan's military culture emphasized conservation, discipline, and making every shot count. America's culture emphasized overwhelming firepower and logistical superiority. One side treated ammunition as precious, the other treated it as disposable. Nakamura's report included a haunting line: "We are fighting as if resources are limited. They are fighting as if resources are infinite. For them, they are." The Browning M2 became a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Japanese soldiers who encountered it in combat learned to recognize its distinctive sound, the slow, methodical thump-thump-thump that could shred cover and suppress entire positions. Unlike lighter machine guns that fired in rapid bursts, the M2's rate of fire was deliberate, around 450 to 550 rounds per minute. Each shot was a half-inch diameter projectile capable of penetrating light armor, concrete walls, and entrenchments. Infantry caught in the open had no defense. The weapon could engage targets over a mile away with devastating accuracy. Pilots flying low-level attacks learned to fear it. The M2's effective range against aircraft extended beyond 1,000 yards, and its armor-piercing rounds could tear through engine blocks and fuel tanks. Japanese commanders began instructing their forces to avoid areas where American M2s were emplaced, a tactical concession that revealed how much respect the weapon commanded. But avoidance was not always possible. At Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, and later in the Philippines, Japanese forces repeatedly found themselves pinned down by interlocking fields of M2 fire. The weapons were often positioned in pairs or groups, covering approaches with overlapping cones of devastation. Charging such positions was suicide. Bypassing them was impossible. The only solution was artillery or air support, both of which Japan had in dwindling supply. After action reports from 1943 and 1944 repeatedly mentioned the Browning M2 as a decisive factor in failed assaults. One officer wrote, "We cannot advance against these guns. Our men are brave, but courage does not stop steel." Another noted, "The Americans place these weapons as if they have an unlimited supply. Every position, every vehicle, every strongpoint is defended by them. It is as if they have more guns than we have soldiers." That observation, meant as hyperbole, was closer to truth than anyone in Tokyo wanted to admit. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By 1943, Japan's own attempts to develop a comparable heavy machine gun were faltering. The Type II heavy machine gun, introduced that year, was an attempt to modernize Japan's aging arsenal. It fired a 13.2mm round, slightly larger than the M2's 12.7mm, and was intended for anti-aircraft and anti-material roles. On paper, it matched the Browning's capabilities. In practice, it was a failure. The Type II was heavier, more complex, and prone to mechanical issues. Its rate of fire was slower, and its reliability in field conditions was abysmal. Worse, production never scaled. Japan managed to produce only a few hundred Type 2s during the entire war, a number so small that most units never saw one. The factories that were supposed to build them were being bombed, their supply chains severed by American submarines, their skilled workers conscripted into the infantry. Meanwhile, American production of the Browning M2 continued to accelerate. By 1943, output exceeded 70,000 units per year. By 1944, it topped 85,000. Factories across the United States, many of which had never built weapons before the war, were now producing M2s with the same efficiency they once used to manufacture automobile parts. Japanese intelligence officers read these figures and felt a creeping despair. The gap was widening. Every month, America added more guns to its inventory than Japan possessed in total. Every week, another factory came online, another assembly line began operating, another shipment of M2s left for the Pacific. There was no catching up. There was no matching output. There was only the slow, grinding realization that Japan was fighting an opponent that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. The Browning M2's longevity revealed another dimension of American industrial strategy. The weapon had been designed by John Moses Browning in the aftermath of World War I and adopted by the U.S. military in 1933. By the time World War II began, it had been in service for nearly a decade. The design was mature, proven, and required no further development. This was critical. While Japan spent valuable resources developing new weapons, refining designs, and experimenting with prototypes, America simply built more of what already worked. The M2 required no updates, no modifications, no engineering, revisions. It was a finished product, perfected before the war began. This allowed American industry to focus entirely on production rather than innovation. There were no delays for testing, no bottlenecks waiting for improved models. The weapon that rolled off the line in 1945 was virtually identical to the one built in 1941. That consistency meant supply chains were stable, training was standardized, and spare parts were universally compatible. A barrel manufactured in Detroit fit a receiver made in Buffalo. A bolt from a gun built in 1942 worked perfectly in a gun assembled in 1944. Japanese weapons, by contrast, often underwent incremental modifications as engineers attempted to improve performance or address field issues. The result was a logistics nightmare. Spare parts from one production run might not fit weapons from another. Maintenance manuals became outdated as designs evolved. Armorers needed specialized knowledge to service different variants. The Browning M2's unchanging design was not a lack of innovation, it was a strategic advantage. Stability in design meant speed in production, and speed in production meant dominance in war. By late 1943, the strategic situation had shifted irreversibly. American forces were advancing across the Pacific, island by island, each landing supported by overwhelming firepower, and everywhere they went, the Browning M2 went with them. On Tarawa, Japanese defenders watched in horror as American landing craft approached the beaches, each one bristling with multiple M2s firing suppressive barrages. The weapons tore through palm trees, concrete bunkers, and defensive positions with methodical efficiency. Even when landing craft were hit and sank, the guns were salvaged, cleaned, and put back into service within hours. At Saipan, Japanese observers counted over 200 M2s in the first wave alone. The weapons were mounted on everything: jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, amphibious vehicles, and portable tripods carried by infantry teams. The island's defenders had fewer than 30 heavy machine guns total, most of them aging Type 92s with limited ammunition. The firepower disparity was so vast that Japanese officers stopped mentioning it in reports. There was no point. The numbers spoke for themselves. What haunted the defenders most was not the volume of fire, but its constancy. American forces never seemed to run out of ammunition. The Browning M2S fired for hours, pausing only to change barrels, then resumed immediately. Belt after belt of .50 caliber rounds fed into the weapons without end. Japanese positions that might have held against rifle fire were obliterated by sustained heavy machine gun barrages that lasted until nothing remained. Survivors reported the same experience. The sound never stopped. The deep, rhythmic pounding of M2 fire became the soundtrack of defeat, a mechanical drumbeat that signaled the approach of an enemy that could not be exhausted, could not be outfought, and could not be stopped. The disparity extended beyond the weapons themselves. American doctrine had evolved around the assumption of material abundance. Every infantry company had organic heavy weapons support. Every vehicle convoy included mounted M2S for defense. Every airfield perimeter was ringed with anti-aircraft positions. The Browning was not treated as a precious asset to be conserved. It was treated as a standard tool, as common as the rifle. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, had to account for scarcity. Heavy machine guns were concentrated at higher command levels and distributed carefully. Units in the field often operated without organic heavy weapons support, relying instead on light machine guns and rifles. When heavy guns were issued, they came with strict ammunition allocations. Crews were expected to make every burst count. This created a fundamental asymmetry in combat. American forces could suppress an entire area with sustained fire, pinning defenders in place while infantry maneuvered. Japanese forces had to choose their moments carefully, firing in short bursts to conserve ammunition, often revealing their positions in the process. The tactical advantage was overwhelming. But more than tactics, it was the psychological weight of fighting an enemy that never ran out. Japanese soldiers had been trained to endure hardship, to fight with limited resources, to make sacrifices for the empire. They were prepared for hunger, exhaustion, and death. What they were not prepared for was the realization that their sacrifices meant nothing against an opponent that could simply outlast them. The Browning M2 embodied that truth. It was not a wonder weapon. It was not technologically superior in a way that seemed impossible to replicate. It was simply there, in vast numbers, firing endlessly, supported by a supply system that treated ammunition the way Japan treated rice, as something to be rationed carefully. Except America never rationed, they simply brought more. Back in Japan, the Ministry of Munitions was facing its own collapse. By 1944, the raw materials needed to sustain weapons production were vanishing. American submarines had severed the maritime supply routes that carried oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, and iron ore from China. The factories that remained operational were forced to use inferior substitutes. Steel quality declined. Alloys became brittle. Precision manufacturing became nearly impossible. The production of heavy machine guns, already a fraction of American output, slowed to a trickle. The Type 92 and Type 2 production lines sputtered along, turning out dozens per month instead of hundreds. Quality control suffered as skilled workers were drafted into combat units or killed in air raids. Weapons that left the factory often arrived at the front with defects, misaligned barrels, faulty feed mechanisms, or receivers that cracked under sustained fire. Field reports documented the growing crisis. One unit commander wrote in September 1944, "Of the 8 heavy machine guns issued to our regiment, only 3 remain operational. 2 were destroyed by enemy fire. 3 have broken down due to mechanical failure and cannot be repaired. We have no spare parts and no hope of resupply. We are instructed to conserve ammunition, but we have almost none left to conserve. The soldiers ask me when reinforcements will arrive. I have no answer." Another report, from a logistics officer in the Philippines. "The enemy lands with vehicles, fuel, ammunition, and food in quantities that seem limitless. We arrive with what we can carry on our backs. When our supplies are exhausted, we are told to forage or capture enemy stores. This is not warfare, it is starvation disguised as strategy." In Tokyo, the officials who had once dismissed the 60,000 figure in the Clay's captured Browning manual now understood its significance. America had not been exaggerating. If anything, they had been conservative. By 1944, the United States was producing more weapons in a single month than Japan produced in a year. And those weapons were not sitting in warehouses. They were in the field, in the hands of soldiers, firing constantly. The Browning M2's dominance extended into the air war as well. American fighters and bombers mounted multiple M2s as offensive armament, using the weapons to strafe ground targets and engage enemy aircraft. The P-51 Mustang carried 6 M2s. The B-17 Flying Fortress bristled with 13 of them. Japanese pilots, already struggling against superior numbers and better-trained opponents, now faced aircraft that could destroy them from angles and distances previously considered safe. The M2's high muzzle velocity and armor-piercing capability made it lethal against even heavily armored targets. Japanese fighters, built light for maneuverability, were shredded by hits that would have merely damaged sturdier aircraft. Bombers attempting to intercept American formations found themselves torn apart by coordinated defensive fire from multiple M2-equipped gun positions. One Japanese pilot, shot down and captured near Iwo Jima, was interrogated about his combat experiences. When asked what surprised him most about American aircraft, he replied simply, "The guns never stop. You cannot evade them. You cannot outlast them. You can only die." That fatalism had spread throughout the Japanese military by late 1944. The early confidence, the belief that spirit and discipline could overcome material disadvantages, had been ground away by the relentless arithmetic of industrial war. Every battle reinforced the same lesson. Courage was not enough. Sacrifice was not enough. Determination was not enough. Against an enemy that could produce 60,000 heavy machine guns per year, nothing was enough. The war had become a contest Japan had already lost, even as its soldiers continued to fight. The final campaigns of the Pacific War revealed the full extent of the disparity. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, American forces landed with over 1,500 Browning M2s supporting the assault. The weapons were everywhere, on landing craft, mounted on Sherman tanks, positioned in anti-aircraft batteries, and carried by infantry teams who set them up on tripods within minutes of reaching the beach. Japanese defenders, entrenched in fortified positions across the island, had fewer than 100 heavy machine guns total. Many were obsolete models, with limited ammunition. The battle lasted 36 days, and for the Japanese garrison, it was a slow extinction. American forces advanced methodically, using M2 fire to suppress every defensive position before infantry closed in. The heavy machine guns fired hundreds of thousands of rounds, chewing through rock, concrete, and steel. When Japanese soldiers attempted counterattacks, they were met with interlocking fields of fire that turned night assaults into massacres. Survivors described the experience in terms that transcended military terminology. "It was not combat," one officer wrote. "It was extermination. The Americans did not fight us. They erased us." At Okinawa, the pattern repeated on an even larger scale. American forces deployed over 3,000 Browning M2s across the island, a concentration of firepower that exceeded the entire heavy machine gun inventory of the Japanese army. The weapons fired continuously for weeks, supporting advances, defending positions, and destroying anything that moved within their range. Japanese forces, dug into caves and tunnels, could only endure. There was no counterattack that could succeed against such firepower. There was no defensive position that could withstand it. There was only the waiting, the hoping that death would be quick rather than slow. By the time Okinawa fell in June 1945, the Japanese military had ceased to function as a coherent force. Units fought in isolation, cut off from supply and command. Soldiers scavenged ammunition from the dead and improvised weapons from wreckage. The industrial base that might have sustained resistance had been destroyed by American bombing. The empire that had once dreamed of dominating Asia was reduced to defending its home islands with bamboo spears and blind faith. In the final weeks before surrender, Japanese officers who had survived the war gathered in quiet rooms and spoke truths that could not be written in official reports. They spoke of the Browning M2, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of everything Japan had underestimated. Colonel Nakamura, the officer who had warned about American industrial capacity in 1941, was among them. He had been proven correct, but there was no satisfaction in it. "We believed the war would be decided by willpower," he said. "We trained our soldiers to endure hardship, to fight without resources, to sacrifice everything for victory." And they did. They endured more than should be asked of any human being. But willpower cannot reload a machine gun. Discipline cannot manufacture ammunition. Sacrifice cannot build factories. Another officer, a logistics specialist who had spent the war trying to stretch impossible supply lines, added, "The Americans fought a different war than we did. We fought with what we had. They fought with what they could make. We counted bullets. They counted factories. When we lost a gun, it was gone. When they lost a gun, they built 10 more. He paused, then said the quiet part aloud. "We were never going to win. Not against that." The room fell silent. It was not defeatism. It was recognition. Japan had entered the war with courage, strategy, and determination. But it had entered a war that would be decided by production capacity, supply chains, and industrial throughput. And in that contest, the outcome had been determined before the first shot was ever fired. The Browning M2, with its 60,000 units per year production rate, had been the first clue. The Jeep, the aircraft carrier, the Liberty ship, and every other product of American industry had simply confirmed what the captured manual had already revealed. Japan was fighting a factory. And factories do not tire, they do not retreat, they do not surrender. They simply build and build and build until the enemy has nothing left to fight with. August 15th, 1945. The Emperor's voice crackled over radios across Japan, announcing the unthinkable. Surrender. For the soldiers who had fought in the Pacific, the news was both devastating and inevitable. They had seen the writing in the smoke of burning cities, in the empty supply depots, in the silence where factories once roared. The war was over, and Japan had lost. In the ruins of Tokyo, engineers and military planners sifted through records, trying to understand the full scope of the defeat. The numbers were stark. Japan had produced approximately 4,000 heavy machine guns during the entire war. The United States had produced over 200,000 Browning M2s. For every gun Japan built, America built 50. The disparity in other categories was equally crushing. Aircraft, ships, tanks, trucks, artillery, ammunition. Every comparison revealed the same exponential gap. Japan had fought with the industrial capacity of a regional power. America had fought with the capacity of a continental empire. But it was the Browning M2 that remained in the memory of those who had faced it. Officers who survived the war carried vivid recollections of that sound, the deep, methodical thump that announced the presence of American forces. Veterans spoke of it in hushed tones, describing how the weapon seemed to fire forever, how its bullets penetrated everything, how its reliability was so absolute that it became a form of psychological warfare. The gun that Captain Tanaka had examined in the wreckage of Fort Stotsenburg in December 1941 had been a prophecy. The figure in the technical manual, 60,000 units per year, had been the truth Japan refused to believe. By the time they accepted it, the war was already lost. In the post-war years, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, engineers studied the Browning M2 with a new perspective. They disassembled captured examples, analyzed the manufacturing techniques, and marveled at the elegance of its simplicity. The weapon's design had not relied on exotic materials or advanced technology. It was built from ordinary steel, using standard machining processes, with tolerances that any competent factory could achieve. The brilliance was not in the weapon itself, it was in the system that produced it. America had not won because it built a better machine gun. It had won because it built an industrial system capable of producing tens of thousands of machine guns without strain. That system, more than any individual weapon, had been the true instrument of victory. Decades later, the Browning M2 remained in service, outlasting every other weapon from World War II. It fought in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Soldiers in the 21st century used guns that were mechanically identical to those that had swept across the Pacific in 1944. The weapon's longevity was a testament to John Moses Browning's genius, but also to the philosophy behind it. Build something that works, build it well, and build it in numbers, too vast to overcome. For Japan, the lesson was carved in steel and memory. The nation that had once believed spirit could triumph over material learned, at immense cost, that modern war was won in factories before it was ever fought on battlefields. The engineers who had examined that first captured Browning in the Philippine jungle had laughed at its size and weight. By the war's end, no one was laughing. They understood, finally and completely, that they had not been fighting soldiers. They had been fighting an economy. And the economy had been unstoppable. The technical manual that Captain Tanaka found on December 16th, 1941, was eventually recovered and preserved in the Japanese military archives. Its pages, yellowed with age, still bore the figure that had haunted a generation of Japanese military planners. Estimated annual production, 60,000 units. That number, once dismissed as impossible, had proven to be conservative. America had exceeded it, and in doing so had demonstrated a truth that would shape warfare for the rest of the century. Industrial capacity is the ultimate weapon. Everything else is detail. The war ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with the quiet acceptance that no amount of courage or strategy could overcome an opponent that measured victory in tons of steel produced per day. The Browning M2 had been the messenger. The message had been simple. You are fighting a nation that builds faster than you can destroy. And in 1945, that message was finally heard. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.